All right, so we've got these three leadership principles. Number one, drive incremental change to build momentum. Number two, set expectations or a vision beyond what people think is possible. And number three, engage in productive conflict. So I'm an outsider. I don't work in the water industry. I'm a leadership, development, and executive coach, and I happen to be connected to the water industry through some clients at the city of Longmont, through Denver Water, and I've also worked with large organizations like Oracle and GE and Columbia Sportswear. I've worked with government organizations like the EPA and the Forest Service and municipalities and other high-tech startups like Ibotta, a fast-growing mobile app company here in Denver. So this is an outsider's perspective. My intent is to give you a little twist on the thinking today, and for you also to think about your style as a leader in your municipality, your utility, because the way that you show up as a leader will either help or hinder your innovation initiatives probably more than anything else. So I want to share with you a few ideas, mostly mistakes, and then some of these shifts that we just talked about through the eyes of a couple of leaders. And these leaders are Ben and Darryl. Ben and Darryl are both from my books, Ignite, the 4 Essential Rules for Emerging Leaders, and my second book, Unite, the 4 Mindset Shifts for Senior Leaders. And Ben is your typical assertive, bold, fast-paced leader. He loves to take control of his environment. Some might even call him aggressive. Darryl, on the other hand, is your friendly, cooperative, agreeable leader. He likes to get along with other people in the workplace. And both of these gentlemen, they're smart, they're engaged, they're the go-to people on the team, and they've been so successful in their organizations that something's about to rock their world. They're about to get promoted. And with that promotion, they will find themselves leading different change initiatives and innovation activities, whether there's a budget and a line item for those initiatives or not. As they get promoted, they're up against something else. And they're up against Peter. And Peter stalks and he lurks and he strikes at these leaders when they are least expecting it. And you may know this, Peter is not a person. Peter is a principle. What's Peter's principle? Anybody know?
Get promoted to their highest level of incompetence.
You will get promoted to your highest level of incompetence, and this happens all the time across the private and the public sector. And when people get promoted to their highest level of incompetence, they get stuck. They make incompetent decisions, and all of the leaders in the pipeline beneath them also get stuck and have to operate at lower levels. It's not only costly for Ben and Darryl in their careers, it's extremely costly for the organizations that are depending on them for creativity and new ideas and innovation. So we're going to take a look at some of the typical mistakes that I see across our private and public sector clients. And as we go through some of these mistakes and these 3 leadership principles that we just set out in that innovation activity, think about how you show up as a leader. And what are your tendencies? Are you more like Ben? Are you more like Darryl? What mistakes are showing up in your world, and how does that help and hinder innovation activities in your workplace? So the first set of mistakes, and the first principle that we'll get to, back to Ben. Remember, Ben's greatest strengths are that he is results-oriented, he's dominant in many ways, he's aggressive, and he gets things done. Right? He's the guy that comes in and fixes things when there's a problem. And by the way, there's 2 male leaders in this story because they work for a female CEO. Just so you know, I don't want to leave the female women out. Bob mentioned the importance of diversity in the workplace, which he's absolutely right. You get a lot better ideas, and more effective leadership teams, by the way, are very diverse. But I didn't want to make this about gender. So I have 2 gentlemen, and they both happen to report into CEO Stephanie, who's female. So the first mistake that Ben makes is there's a level of rigidity. And I call this the Popeye syndrome. I am what I am. There's an inflexibility that comes with Ben's style. What are the implications of the Popeye syndrome? I am what I am. do you think?
Kills innovation.
Kills innovation?
Status quo.
Status quo. Yeah, and for Ben, this is really about him lacking the self-awareness as a leader to even know that he's rigid. And he spends way too much time trying to look smart, be the hero, and save other people, as opposed to being flexible enough to effectively drive innovation activities. Now, Darryl, on the other hand, remember, he's our friendly, cooperative, accepting, engaging, friendly leader. And for Darryl, part of his fear is that he's overly concerned about imposing on other people. He doesn't want to bother his people. They're already busy enough. They've got enough going on in the workplace. So he manages everything remotely through his project tracker or email. He delegates, he sets his vision, he gives feedback, all from a distance and all from a level of hands-off. And remember, our first principle in that last activity was to make or to drive incremental change to build that initial momentum. And oftentimes we may not have funding for that initial momentum, or we might have to change the status quo to move beyond how we're hardwired. The problem is when Ben is overly rigid, people on his team won't take risk. And why? Because they're fearful of his style. I was just working with a client last week, a tech company that has a small office in Omaha, Nebraska, and they run these IT projects. And at the very beginning of their projects, the project teams are very aligned with their CEO. Over time, they describe something that happens, they call it the V. The expectations of the project team starts to differ from the project team of the CEO. And guess what? The project team members are too scared to say anything. And so the scope of the projects get out of hand, and projects lose quality, and they don't get done on time. Darryl, on the other hand, he's got this avoidance tendency. Remember, he's the hands-off guy. He leads through his computer terminal or his mobile device. He's not hands-on enough in order to drive that incremental change, in order to move people to start doing something differently. And so as leaders, we often have to balance opposing characteristics. And in order to make this first leadership change, to drive incremental change so that we can start creating some momentum, on one hand, we have to be courageous. We've got to take some risk ourselves as leaders. We might have to make some people changes against some loyalties that we've had, people that we've worked with for a long time. It takes a lot of courage to do that. And on the other hand, we have to be humble. Right? This isn't about your own agenda and your own ego or even your own team. And what we know is that humility is a core characteristic of effective, sustainably great leaders. And some of that is research-driven. You can read about it from Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, when he describes the level 5 leader. So my question for you, as you're thinking about driving incremental change in your organization, if you had to work for you, would you actually want to work for you? This is a great question for leaders to ask. Would you work for you as you think about this first leadership principle? All right, principle number 2. Back to Ben. So Ben is, again, that very results-oriented leader, and the challenge that Ben has is he tends to solve one problem at a time. So he sees a problem and he fixes it. He sees another problem and he fixes that one too. And there's this ongoing cycle. It's a tension and relief cycle. Ongoing, where it's fix a problem and see a problem and fix it. And instead of communicating a vision and thinking long term, he sees leadership as rescuing others. And it's a dysfunctional way to lead people. I was talking to someone else at the table last night, and they were talking about an engineer on their team, and this person was describing their engineers as being great at solving like these really critical problems. And in fact, when you gave them time pressure and short amounts of time, they did a fantastic job. As leaders of innovation, we need you to think longer term, because this is short-sighted and it's tactical. Darryl, on the other hand, our friendly, cooperative, get along with everybody kind of leader, he tends to smother his feedback with positives. So anyone hear of the old feedback sandwich? Right? Say something nice up front, something nice on the back end, and just slide that feedback in the middle. And no one really knows what the leader's trying to communicate. And when we're trying to create change, people have to know what they expect from their leaders. And if we're not coaching and developing our leaders every day, people will not have clarity. So when people come up to Elon Musk and they say, Elon, it's going to take us 18 months to build this. He says, great, do it in 3. And in that innovation activity, when you said, excellent, look, we just went from 12 seconds to 4. We're good, we're done. Can we go get some coffee? How many people were satisfied? But I said, no, do it in under 1. And you did. And in fact, you beat my own expectations. So the second principle here is to set those expectations beyond what people think is possible. And in order to do that, as leaders, you have to balance a couple other sets of opposing characteristics. On one hand, you have to be demanding. Right? You've got to set high expectations. People will live up to the expectations that you set, or they'll live down to the expectations that you set. Leaders get what they expect, and they get what they tolerate. It's part of the challenge that Darryl has with his avoidance tendency is he tolerates underperformance in the workplace. And on the other hand, you've got to balance that with empathy. And empathy happens to be a core foundation of how we build trust in the workplace. And without trust, guess what? We can't do principle number 3, which is the engaging in conflict. So being demanding and being empathetic. So as you think about yourself in the workplace and setting that vision and those high expectations beyond what people think is possible, would you work for you? Would you be inspired? Would you have clarity? Principle number 3, back to Ben. Ben has this tendency of getting stuck in always having to be right. He hasn't really made that transition as a more mature leader. And this might be the most dangerous mistake that I lay out today. Because when Ben shoots down ideas that others have that don't mesh with his own, what happens? People stop using their brain and bringing other ideas forward. They should
think of it.
Wait, well, you know what?
Ben will figure it out.
Ben will figure it out. I suggested something last time and he didn't listen to me.
So we'll just wait for Ben to catch up.
We'll just wait.
Why even talk? You're not listening to me.
Why even?
Right.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So why even share an idea? People stop using their brains. I think Ken Blanchard said that. They stop bringing their brains to work. And that is not what we're trying to do here. Remember, you may not even have an innovation budget line item yet. So we've got to encourage people to take some risk-taking. Now, there's another challenge that comes with this. As Ben rises to higher levels of leadership, he's less and less likely, because of this tendency and because of positional power, he's less and less likely to hear the truth of what's going on in his own organization. And some of you may know about this. How many leaders here have seen their managers? They're funnier than anybody else on the team, right? Their jokes are funny. Well, they're funnier than anybody else is on the team. They're the fount of all wisdom. And it's a challenge. It's a leadership dilemma that people face. 1, because of positional power, and 2, because of personality. A strong personality like Ben's is going to get in the way. Number 2, when we look at Darryl, our friendly, cooperative leader, one of the challenges that we see with Darryl is that he's overly focused on consensus. Remember, he's worried about imposing on other people, so he wants to get everybody's ideas. And he wants to basically appease everybody. Consensus is a great decision-making process. Company outings and bowling and picnics. It takes way too long to get anything done if you're trying to appease everybody on your team. And you can't. What typically happens on teams is not consensus, but an aura of consensus, where a few loud voices are speaking for the group, and we call it consensus. Now, there's an element of consensus that's really key, and it plays into this third principle of engaging in productive conflict is making sure that we create space for people's voices to be heard. And when people know or feel valued and feel like they've been heard, they'll be much more likely to be committed, regardless of whether they agree with the decision that the leader's making or not.
Right.
So focus on commitment instead of consensus. So this third piece, this third leadership principle, is engage in productive conflict. And for Ben, if he's shooting those ideas down, people aren't going to engage. They're not going to bring those ideas to the table. He's not going to create that space for people to engage in that productive conflict. And Darryl, on the other hand, he's just waiting too long. He's great at bringing people in, but he's taking too long to push an idea forward. So in order to really put this leadership principle in place, we have to balance two additional characteristics: drive with vulnerability. On one hand, we have to be driven, and we have to have resolve to do what's right for the organization, as opposed to our own agenda or our own ego or our own teams. And number two, we have to be vulnerable. Vulnerability in the workplace is about asking for help. It's about offering help. It's about admitting mistakes. And when we create that environment of vulnerability, we're much more likely to have trust, and we're much more likely to be engaged in productive conflict in the workplace. So when it comes to you, what kind of environment do you create as a leader? Is there that drive coupled with vulnerability? And would you want to work for you? So who are you more like? Ben or Darryl? If you're more like Ben, stand up and move over here. Just huddle around this area. If you're more like Darryl, put everything down. If you're more like Darryl, stand up and sort of huddle over in this area. Now, many of us are like both in different ways, but I'm going to force you to make a decision. Where's your natural tendency? Ben over here, Darryl over there.